No one in that dining hall knew her name. They didn't know her past. They didn't know the wars she had survived, the silent ones and the loud ones. All they saw was an elderly woman with silver hair, seated alone at a long mahogany table. And when the slap landed, sharp, public, humiliating, the room froze. No one stood up. No one spoke. Because no one knew that the woman who had just been slapped was a billionaire. And no one imagined that her daughter wore a uniform trained for war. What happened next would shake that room and follow every witness for the rest of their lives. Stay with me. Who was this old woman, really? Why did she remain silent after the slap? And how did one cruel moment at a dinner table turn into a lesson about power, dignity, and consequences? Was the slap the end of the story or the beginning of something far more terrifying? Because some people mistake silence for weakness and age for irrelevance. They are always wrong. This is a story about assumptions, about the masks people wear in public and the strength they hide behind quiet eyes. It's about what happens when someone pushes too far, crosses a line they didn't even know existed, and faces consequences they never saw coming. Can you imagine being humiliated in front of strangers? Can you imagine watching someone you love be degraded and doing nothing in that moment because you trust something greater is at work? Hold that feeling. You're going to need it. Her name was Margaret Hale. At 68, she walked slowly, not because she was fragile, but because she had learned patience from life. Decades earlier, Margaret had built an empire from nothing. She survived betrayal, market crashes, a failed marriage, and a world that told her women should stay quiet. She listened instead. She observed. She remembered. Wealth never changed her. It only refined her silence. Margaret grew up in a town where dinner meant canned soup and day-old bread. Her father worked 3 jobs. Her mother cleaned houses for families who never learned her name. Margaret wore the same 2 dresses to school for years. She learned early that people judge you by what they see, not who you are. So she decided to become someone they couldn't ignore, not through noise, but through action. By 25, she had started her first business, a logistics company that connected small manufacturers with international buyers. It was unsexy work. No headlines, no glamour, just spreadsheets, phone calls, and 18-hour days. People doubted her. Banks refused her loans. Investors laughed when she pitched. But Margaret had something they didn't: hunger. Not for luxury, but for proof. Proof that a girl from nowhere could build something that mattered. By 35, her company was worth $8 million. By 45, $80 million. By 50, she had sold it for just over $500 million. But she never changed her address, never bought a mansion, never wore her wealth like a crown. She lived in a modest townhouse, drove a 12-year-old sedan, and donated more than she spent. And Eleanor Hale. Raised without privilege, without shortcuts, Margaret never told her child she was wealthy. Instead, she taught her discipline, humility, and courage. Eleanor grew up thinking her mother was comfortable, not rich. She mowed lawns in summer. She worked at a diner during college. She applied for scholarships and student loans like everyone else. When Eleanor told her mother she wanted to join the military, Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't offer money to avoid it. She simply said, "Do it right." Eleanor chose the army, not for glory, but for purpose. She wanted to serve something bigger than herself. Years of training followed: boot camp, officer school, deployment to conflict zones where survival wasn't guaranteed and mistakes cost lives. Eleanor became sharp, focused, and unshakable. She learned to read people in seconds, to assess threats, to act with precision under pressure. Margaret aged. Eleanor deployed. Their phone calls were brief but deep. They didn't need many words. They understood each other in the way only people who've both fought wars can, even if those wars look different. Margaret's battles were in boardrooms. Eleanor's were in deserts and mountains. But both knew what it meant to stand alone, to be underestimated, and to prove the doubters wrong. And that night, the night everything changed, Margaret was invited to a charity dinner hosted by an elite social circle that valued appearances more than character. It was held at the Grandview Estate, a historic venue with vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with art worth more than most people's homes. The guest list included politicians, corporate executives, old money families, and social climbers desperate to be seen. Margaret came alone. She didn't need a plus one. She didn't need to impress anyone. She was there because the charity supported veteran services, and that mattered to her. She wore a simple navy dress, pearl earrings her mother had left her, and flat shoes. While other women arrived in gowns and diamonds, Margaret looked like someone's grandmother. And to most in that room, that's exactly what she was. Invisible, irrelevant, easy to overlook. That was her first mistake, or so they thought. But Margaret didn't mind being underestimated. She had learned long ago that the quietest person in the room often holds the most power. She took her assigned seat at a long mahogany table near the back. Around her sat strangers making small talk about vacation homes, stock portfolios, and whose children had gotten into which Ivy League schools. Margaret listened politely, sipped water, and observed. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Across the table sat Victor Langford, mid-50s, loud, entitled, a man who mistook money for authority and cruelty for confidence. Victor had inherited his wealth from a father who built it and a grandfather who started it. He had never created anything himself, never risked anything, never struggled. But he spoke as if he had conquered the world. He wore a custom suit, gold cufflinks, and a watch that cost more than a new car. His laugh was too loud, his opinions too certain, and his need for attention, exhausting. Margaret noticed him immediately, not because he stood out, but because he demanded to. He interrupted others. He corrected the waiter. He name-dropped people he'd met once and acted like they were close friends. At first, Margaret ignored him. She had met 1,000 Victor Langfords in her life. Men who believed their bank accounts made them important. Men who treated service workers like furniture. Men who thought respect was something they deserved, not something they earned. But then Victor turned his attention to her. Started small. Comment about her dress. "Oh, keeping it simple tonight, are we?" Margaret smiled politely and said nothing. Then a remark about her choice of water instead of wine. Not a drinker? Or just watching the pennies? A few people chuckled. Margaret's smile didn't falter. She had been insulted by better men than him. But Victor wasn't done. He was the kind of man who needed a reaction. Silence annoyed him. It made him feel small. So he pushed harder. When the first course arrived, Margaret politely asked a server if she could move to a different seat. The noise at her end of the table was overwhelming, and she had trouble hearing. It was a simple request. Reasonable. Quiet. But Victor heard it and saw an opportunity. "Oh, not enjoying our company?" He said it loud enough for half the table to hear. Margaret met his eyes calmly and said, "I'm just looking for a quieter spot. That's all." Victor leaned back in his chair, grinning. "Maybe you're just not used to being around successful people." The table went quiet. A few guests looked down at their plates. Others shifted uncomfortably. Margaret felt the sting of the words but kept her composure. She had faced worse. She had been doubted, dismissed, and disrespected by men with more power and better insults. This was nothing new. But then she made a choice. A small one. A dignified one. She corrected him. Gently. "Success isn't about volume, Mr. Langford. It's about impact." It wasn't loud. It wasn't meant to humiliate. It was just the truth spoken calmly. But to Victor, it was a slap in the face. His smile vanished. His jaw tightened. The people around them went still. For a man like Victor, being corrected, especially by a woman, especially by an older woman who looked like she didn't belong, was unforgivable. His pride cracked. And when pride cracks in men like him, violence follows. Not always physical, but always real. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he spoke low and cold. "You should learn your place." Margaret said nothing. She simply looked at him with the calm, steady gaze of someone who had seen rage before and survived it. And then the slap. It wasn't hard enough to injure. but it was loud enough to humiliate. The sound echoed across the dining hall like a gunshot. Gasps filled the room. Forks clattered onto plates. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Every head turned. Margaret's cheek burned. Her skin flushed red where his palm had landed. But her eyes remained steady. She didn't cry out, didn't flinch, didn't retaliate. She just sat there, absorbing the shock, the shame, the cruelty of it. Victor smirked. He leaned back in his chair, satisfied. He had put her in her place. Or so he thought. Around them, no one moved. No one spoke. A few women looked horrified. A few men looked uncomfortable. But no one stood up for her. No one confronted Victor. Because in rooms like that, power protects power. And an old woman in a simple dress had none. But Margaret wasn't thinking about the slap. She was thinking about something else. She was thinking about her daughter. About the lessons she had taught her. About strength that doesn't shout. About dignity that doesn't break. And she realized this wasn't about anger. It was about power. And she was about to teach Victor Langford what real power looked like. If you were sitting at that table, what would you have done? Would you have shouted? Would you have fought back? Would you have walked away? Think about that. Because what Margaret did next, most people wouldn't have the strength to do. Margaret stood. Slowly. Not to retaliate, but to leave. She placed her napkin on the table, smoothed her dress, and rose with the kind of grace that only comes from decades of controlling your emotions in rooms that wanted to see you break. That silence hurt Victor more than any scream. He expected tears. He expected a scene. He expected her to shrink. Instead, she walked. Past the table. Past the whispers. Past the stairs. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floor. Each step deliberate, measured, dignified. No one stopped her. No one apologized. The event organizers pretended not to notice. The other guests returned to their meals, eager to forget what they had just witnessed. But Margaret didn't forget. She never forgot anything. Outside, the cool night air hit her face. The city hummed around her, indifferent to her pain. Margaret stood under a street lamp, her hand trembling slightly as she reached into her purse. She pulled out her phone. She didn't call a lawyer. She didn't call the police. She didn't call a friend to vent or cry. She called one number, the only number that mattered. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Mom? Eleanor's voice was steady, alert. Even thousands of miles away, even in the middle of the night in whatever time zone she was in, she answered. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't explain the details. She simply said, Eleanor, I need you. There was a pause. Not hesitation. Assessment. Soldiers know when to move. I'll be there, Eleanor said. And the line went quiet. Margaret took a cab home. She didn't look back at the Grandview estate. She didn't replay the slap in her mind. She had learned long ago not to dwell on cruelty. Cruelty was noise. Action was power. At home, she made herself tea, the same kind her mother used to make, chamomile with honey. She sat in her living room, surrounded by books and photographs, memories of a life built brick by brick. Her cheek still stung, but her mind was calm. She knew what was coming. Not revenge. Something better. Accountability. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Captain Eleanor Hale sat in a military barracks staring at her phone. She had just finished a 14-hour day. Her uniform smelled like dust and sweat. Her body ached. But none of that mattered now. Her mother had never asked for help. Not once. Not during the divorce. Not during the business battles. Not even during the cancer scare 5 years ago. If she was asking now, something was very wrong. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She made calls. She requested emergency leave. She contacted a military lawyer, a family friend who owed her a favor. She started gathering information. Who was at the dinner? Who saw what happened? Were there cameras? Witnesses? Eleanor had spent years learning how to gather intelligence, how to build a case, how to execute a mission. This was no different. By morning, legal wheels turned. Eleanor's lawyer contacted the Grandview estate. They requested security footage. The estate management hesitated. Events like that were private. Guests valued discretion. But when the request came from a lawyer representing a decorated military officer and a victim of assault, they couldn't ignore it. By noon, the footage was secured. It showed everything. The conversation, the insult, the slap, Victor's smirk, Margaret's silent exit. By nightfall, investigations began. Not criminal, not yet, but civil. A formal complaint was filed. Witnesses were contacted. Some refused to speak. Others, guilt-ridden by their silence, came forward. They described Victor's behavior, his pattern of cruelty, his history of treating people beneath him like trash. Margaret didn't watch the footage. She didn't need to. She had lived it. But Eleanor watched. 3 times. Each time her jaw tightened. Each time her hands clenched. She wasn't angry. Anger was messy. She was focused. And focus in the right hands was unstoppable. Victor Langford slept peacefully that night. And the night after, he went to work. He had lunch with colleagues. He laughed about the dinner, bragging to a friend about putting some old woman in her place. He had no idea the ground beneath him had already cracked. How would you feel if someone treated your mother, your grandmother, someone you love like that? How would you respond? Would you seek revenge or justice? There's a difference. And Eleanor Hale knew exactly which one mattered. 3 days later, Victor received a summons. Not from the restaurant. Not from the police. From the Department of Defense. He stared at the envelope, confused. He wasn't military. He had no contracts with the government. He had never even been audited. His assistant brought it to him during a meeting, her face pale. She had opened it by mistake. "Sir, I think you need to see this." Victor ripped it open, annoyed. Inside was a formal notice. A hearing. A request for his presence regarding an incident involving a protected individual connected to ongoing federal partnerships. The language was cold, legal, serious. Victor's confusion turned to irritation. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "Some kind of mistake." But it wasn't, because Margaret Hale wasn't just wealthy. She was a ghost in the system. A silent philanthropist who funded veterans' hospitals, military family housing, PTSD treatment programs, and classified research into prosthetics for injured soldiers. Her donations ran into the hundreds of millions. And because of that, she had relationships. Not the social kind, the institutional kind. People in the Department of Defense knew her name. People in Congress knew her contributions. And her daughter? A decorated officer with authority, discipline, and a voice the system respected. Eleanor had served 3 tours. She had saved lives. She had been recommended for commendation twice. When she made a request, people listened. The hearing was scheduled in a private government office. Victor arrived with his lawyer, a man who specialized in making problems disappear. But when they entered the room, Victor's confidence faltered. Seated across from him was Margaret, calm, composed. Beside her sat Eleanor in full uniform, ribbons on her chest, eyes like steel. And at the head of the table, a federal mediator flanked by 2 representatives from the Department of Defense. "This isn't a court," the mediator said, "but it is a reckoning." Footage surfaced. The same footage Eleanor's lawyer had secured. It played on a screen in the room. Silent, damning. Victor watched himself slap an elderly woman. Watched himself smirk. Watched the room do nothing. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Then the mediator spoke. "Mr. Langford, are you aware that the woman you assaulted is a major contributor to veteran services? That her donations have directly funded programs saving the lives of active duty soldiers and their families? That her daughter, seated here, is a captain in the United States Army?" Victor's face went pale. He opened his mouth, closed it. No words came. The mediator continued. "This incident has been reported. Witnesses have come forward. The estate has cooperated. You have 2 choices. You can face public prosecution, which will involve media attention, civil suits, and reputational destruction. Or you can accept accountability, apologize publicly, submit to a restorative justice program, and make a significant donation to veteran services in Margaret Hale's name. Choose now." Victor looked at his lawyer. The lawyer looked at the floor. There was no way out. This wasn't a room where money could buy silence. This was a room where actions had consequences. Victor's hands trembled. He turned to Margaret. She didn't look angry. She looked disappointed. And that, somehow, was worse than rage. For the first time in his life, Victor Langford felt small. Not because someone overpowered him, but because someone outthought him, outnumbered him, outclassed him. He tried to speak. His voice cracked. "I'm sorry." Margaret said nothing. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "Sorry isn't enough, but it's a start. What would you do in that moment? Would you forgive? Would you demand more? Would you feel satisfaction or sadness watching someone realize they're not untouchable?" Margaret refused revenge. She asked for accountability. And there's a difference. Revenge is about making someone suffer. Accountability is about making someone understand. Victor issued a public apology, not to save face, but to survive. It was published in the same social circles where the dinner had been held. He admitted his behavior. He named Margaret. He took responsibility. It was humiliating, but it was necessary. And along with the apology came a donation, $500,000 to veteran services. Not because Victor was generous, but because consequences demanded it. Margaret accepted it quietly. She didn't gloat. She didn't make a spectacle. She simply moved forward. Because that's what strong people do. They don't get stuck in the past. They don't let cruelty define them. They extract the lesson and keep walking. Later, Eleanor stood beside her mother in the same townhouse where she had grown up. The same kitchen where Margaret had taught her to make pancakes. The same living room where they had watched old movies together. Eleanor was still in uniform. She had a flight back to base in the morning. "Why didn't you fight back?" she asked. Margaret smiled. The kind of smile that holds a lifetime of wisdom. Because power doesn't need to shout. It waits. Eleanor thought about that. She thought about all the times in the field when patience saved lives. When waiting for the right moment meant the difference between success and failure. Her mother had taught her that long before the military did. Margaret poured 2 cups of tea. They sat together in comfortable silence. Then Eleanor spoke again. "Do you think he learned anything?" Margaret considered the question. Maybe, maybe not. But the people who watched him learn, they learned. And that's enough. The story didn't end with Victor. It rippled outward. The people at that dinner, the ones who had stayed silent, they couldn't forget. Some felt guilt. Some felt shame. A few reached out to Margaret privately, apologizing for not intervening. She accepted their apologies with grace. Others changed their behavior. They started speaking up when they saw cruelty. They stopped laughing at cruel jokes. They remembered the woman in the navy dress who walked out with her head high. That's the thing about dignity. It's contagious. When you see someone refuse to be broken, it gives you permission to do the same. Margaret returned home not as a victim, but as a reminder. The strongest people don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves when it matters most. She continued her quiet life. She continued her quiet donations. She continued being underestimated. And she was fine with that, because she knew something most people never learn. True power is invisible until it needs to be seen. Eleanor returned to duty. She carried the story with her. And when younger soldiers asked her about leadership, about strength, about how to handle disrespect, she told them about her mother, about the slap, about the silence, about the reckoning. And every time she told it, they listened, because it wasn't just a story about revenge. It was a story about character, about choosing dignity over rage, about playing the long game, about understanding that the people who underestimate you are giving you the greatest advantage of all. And years later, when Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 83, her funeral was attended by hundreds, veterans, soldiers, families who had been helped by her donations, people whose lives had been quietly changed by a woman most of the world never knew. Eleanor stood at the front, in full dress uniform, and spoke about her mother. Not about her wealth, not about her business success, but about her strength, her silence, her refusal to be small in a world that wanted her to shrink. That night, Margaret returned home, not as a victim, but as a reminder. The strongest people don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves when it matters most. And in the end, that's the lesson. Not that the powerful will always win, but that power isn't what we think it is. It's not loud. It's not violent. It's not about dominance. Real power is knowing who you are. It's controlling your response when the world tries to break you. It's choosing justice over vengeance. It's walking out of a room with your dignity intact. It's teaching the next generation not by preaching, but by example. Margaret Hale never needed the world to know her name. She only needed the people who mattered to remember what she stood for. And they did. They always would. What would you have done in her place? Is silence weakness or wisdom? If you were Margaret, would you have responded differently? If you were Eleanor, how far would you have gone to protect your mother? And if you were one of the people at that dinner, one of the silent witnesses, what would you do today to make up for that moment? Tell us in the comments. We want to know, because stories like this aren't just about other people. They're mirrors. They show us who we are, who we want to be, and who we're afraid we might become. Think about the people in your life who have been underestimated. Your parents, your grandparents, the quiet ones, the ones who never brag, never demand attention, never make a scene. What battles have they fought that you don't even know about? What strength are they hiding behind tired eyes and soft voices? And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that dignity is a choice and power is earned, not given, then subscribe. Subscribe for more timeless tales of dignity, justice, and unexpected strength. Because the next story, it begins with a whisper and ends with a truth no one was ready for. It's about a man who lost everything and found something more valuable than money. It's about a child who saw something no child should see and grew up to change the system. It's about ordinary people who did extraordinary things not because they wanted glory, but because it was right. And just like Margaret Hale, they did it quietly, until the world had no choice but to listen. So stay with us. Click that button. Turn on notifications. Because these stories, they matter. And the people who watch them, people like you matter too. Let us know where you're watching from, what this story made you feel, what you would have done. Because we're not just telling stories. We're building a community of people who believe that character still counts, that dignity still matters, that silence, real silence, the kind that comes from strength, not fear, that silence can change the world. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And remember, the next time you see someone who looks small, who seems invisible, who stays quiet while the loud ones take up space, remember Margaret Hale. Because you never know who you're looking at. You never know what wars they've survived. And you never know what their daughter might be trained to do.